Hi there, it's me once again. I'm here to talk about The Walking Dead Season 6 episode 11 called Knots Untie, which was in Season 6. Sorry, took a while because I've just been busy. So here we go. We talk about Season 6, Episode 11, Knots Untie. It all started off with Abraham and Sasha coming into the gates of Alexandria. So eventually, like, they were talking all that about Maggie having a baby and all that, but Abraham called it a pup. I'm like, Abe, she's having a baby, not a puppy. So, but eventually it was kind of cute, and then he told Sasha he'll see her in the morning. And she says, I switched shifts with Eugene. We talked about it, so I'm taking over another shift. And he said, okay, but he keeps looking at her when she walks away. Then we turn to Abraham and Rosita in the sack after a night of wild lovemaking, which I believe this is going to be the last time. But eventually Rosita got up and she gave Abraham a chain, and it had like a headlight, broken headlight that he said for luck, and so she threw it to him, and he says, Rosita Espinosa, you are amazing. And so she said, show me in the shower. And he says, I'll be right in. So eventually she walks in, starts to shower, and Abraham was just thinking, he was not thinking of Rosita at all. He was thinking of Sasha. Then we go to Glenn and Maggie. Maggie was prepping up some crops so they could grow, because she plans to grow their own crops so they could have fresh food like for everyone in Alexandria. But eventually, when Glenn and Maggie were talking, Denise came up panicking from the holding house. So eventually she started to panic for some reason, to say that Jesus has escaped. So Glenn and Maggie went to rush to see what's going on. But meanwhile, Jesus was at Rick's house. He was looking at the picture, and then Carl came with the gun. He says, what are you doing in our house? And he goes, I'm waiting for your mom and dad to get dressed so we can talk. My name is Jesus, by the way. So this is the first time Carl meets Jesus. Then Rick and Michonne came out. Michonne was fully dressed, but Rick was dressed, but he was shirtless. And then all of a sudden, then there was Glenn, Daryl, and I believe Maggie or Abraham that came up with guns, and they were pointing at Jesus, and he says, it's okay. But eventually they looked pretty surprised with the way they were dressed. So they were all downstairs moments later, and they gave Jesus a cookie, and he says, thank you very much for the cookie, compliments of the chef. And Daryl goes, she ain't here. And she goes, okay. And so he talks about how he trusts them, and I know, I told him how he escaped. That says knots untie. He untied the knot, and then I guess he went out the third floor or something like that. So eventually they agreed to go with Jesus and help him out with scavenging supplies. And his community helps them out, a lot of people. And then Jesus went, your world's about to get a lot bigger now. Okay, so when they were getting the RV ready to go up to this hilltop, and Daryl was fixing the engine or something went out, but Denise gave him one of her homemade oat cakes, and he says, I'll get something down the road. It looks like shit, it'll taste like shit. And she goes, shit is better than roadkill. And then Denise looks at him and goes, just eat it. And she takes off. And eventually, as soon as everybody was getting into the RV, Rick was holding Judith. Rick explained to Carl what happened to him, Michonne. It just happened. But Carl was very cool with it. And he told him to get his stuff. And she was going to bring Judith over to Gabe. But eventually, Carl chose to stay back because he needs to keep the place safe, and so he volunteered to take Judith. But eventually everybody Rick, Michonne, Daryl, Abraham, Glenn, Maggie, and Jesus all went into the RV and they took off for the hilltop. But eventually the funniest thing was in the RV, Maggie was asleep and Glenn put his hand on her stomach, hoping he can feel the baby. But eventually Abraham saw this and he said, talk to Glenn. He says, Glenn, can I ask you something? And Glenn goes, yeah. When you were pouring the Bisquick, were you making pancakes? And then I was just growling, and then Glenn went, yeah, yes I was. So, and they had a little chat about this Bisquick stuff. And then all of a sudden, and then they were all chillaxing still, and then Rick was driving the RV, Michonne was in the front seat, and Rick had his hand on Michonne's knee, and it was kind of cute. And then Daryl looked out the window, cracked the blinds through the window, and he says, Rick, hold up. And then there was a car accident, and then you see a lot of walkers there. And then Rick came out, and then he holds his gun up to Jesus. He says, is this some kind of a trap? And he goes, no, I know my people are in there. They're good people. They're in trouble. We got to save them. And then Daryl saw some tracks because they know, because Daryl's an awesome tracker. So eventually they all went into this place where got people up from the hilltop is being held for safety. And eventually, Maggie offered to look out for Jesus. So eventually, in case Rick put Jesus in handcuffs, and Maggie held a gun on him. And so eventually, as soon as it happened, the rest of them went into the building to search for the survivors. Now, Rick and Michonne saw one group of survivors, which was okay. Glenn and Daryl saw another survivor, and we will get to know him a bit. And eventually he says, I can't go with you yet. My friend's still out there. He's been hurt. And he goes, okay. And eventually Abraham was trying to look for walkers and all that. And then all of a sudden he grabs this guy. He thought he was a walker, but he turned out he was alive. And it turned out to be the guy's friend. And so they got everybody, all the saviors, all the hilltop people out. And they went back to the RV to take it back to the hilltop. And eventually we found out one of the guys that was saved by Glenn and Daryl was named Harlan, and he was an obstetrician. And eventually he said, he introduced them to Glenn and Maggie and says to both of them, you just hit the jackpot, because he has the prenatal vitamins. So as they were driving along, going to the hilltop, something went wrong. The RV got stuck in the mud. And then he said, we got a problem. We're stuck in the mud. And then Jesus goes to Rick, no problem. We are here. We're at the hilltop. This is the hilltop. So eventually everybody all got out. They're all heading up to the hilltop. And then there were these two guys on the wall. They have spears and all that. And Jesus told them to open the gate. And eventually they held out their guns. And he says, Jesus tried to explain to them, there are friends and people from the hilltop saying they saved our lives. And he says, well, have them hand over the weapons. And then Daryl goes, are you going to make us? And then Jesus went, just open the gate. We can meet Gregory out here. And he says, no, we're going in to meet Gregory. And so eventually the gate opens. They open the gate, and he explains on the hilltop about the house and everything else. They have trailers and all that. And eventually they walked in, and it used to be a museum, which it was very beautiful. It was a very lovely building. And eventually they all went inside, and Abraham's line is, good gracious Ignatius. And then out comes Gregory, played by the wonderful Xander Berkeley. He's a fine actor. And eventually he introduced them to Jesus. Jesus introduces Gregory to everybody. And they want to talk to him. And he says, why don't you all get cleaned up first? And then we'll talk. And they went, Okay, fine. And says, why? We're fine. And then Gregory goes up to Rick and says, it's hard to keep this place clean nowadays. And they went, okay. And then Rick, when they were going upstairs, Rick told Maggie, you need to be the one who talks to Gregory. And she said, why me? Because it has to be you. So eventually Maggie walks into Gregory's office and then says, and he keeps calling her Natalie, which is Maggie. Gregory, you idiot. So eventually they started talking. Eventually they wanted to have a deal. And he says, if you want half of our stuff, you got to work for it. Do anything. Stay here. And then Maggie goes, first of all, you're going to listen up. You're going to stop calling me honey. You're not going to come on to me or anything. We need food. We need supplies very badly. Alexandria's suffering here, and then eventually you gotta help us out. We help you. You help us. Got it? And he goes off, and then Gregory went. He was being a real dick as usual. And eventually, meanwhile, outside, Abraham and Daryl were having a conversation. Abraham told Daryl, so how long have Rick and Michonne been umping Buglies? And then Daryl went, I don't know. And then Abraham talks to Daryl saying, do you ever think about it? Settling down. And then he goes, do you think she'd settle? I don't know what he said, but it's either she'd settle or shit settled. So I'm going to aim for she'd settle. So we don't know. Like when now season 6 is out on DVD, we'll have to check it out. And then when everybody got all cleaned up and all that, Gregory, they were trying to negotiate with Gregory to get all the supplies and all that. And one of the Hilltop members says, we're back. And so eventually there were more Hilltop members that were coming back. So Gregory went out, and they went out with the rest of them went out followed Gregory out. And then there was this big, massive man named Caleb, and he says, what happened to one of the guys? I think his name was Ethan, by the way. I think one of these guys was killed. And then he goes, Negan, right? Yeah. And he said, and eventually Ethan goes up to Gregory and says, I have a message from Negan. He puts his hand on his shoulder and he says, I'm sorry. And he stabs Gregory right in the stomach. And then he collapsed down, helped by Maggie and Jesus. And Rick came down and started beating the shit out of Ethan. And then Abraham went and started beating the crap out of Andy. And so eventually, there was all hell broke loose and everyone was staring. And eventually, Andy was choking Abraham. And he was like, then he started having this fantasy and all that, saying that, I want to live or something like that. And then Daryl comes behind him and pulls Andy off Abraham and breaks his arm. Oh man. And then Caleb put a knife against Rick's throat. And then Ethan said, if you ever don't come near, or I'll kill him, I'll swear. And Michonne goes, hey Rick. And then he grabs Ethan's knife and stabs Ethan in the throat, and all the blood was coming down. He was all covered in blood and all that. And then he got up, and there were a lot of spectators around the hilltop, and everyone was staring at Rick while he's all covered in blood. And then he said the famous word that came from the comic, "What?" And meanwhile, one of the guys had, with a spear, went to try to attack Rick, and then Rick came with a gun. They were face off with each other, and then Jesus went, "Stop! It's over. That's enough. Gregory is hurt, and we have to remember him that he was a good, decent being, not the coward that he was. Just remember him for that." Ethan. So eventually after Jesus made the peace, they brought Gregory inside, and And meanwhile, Abraham was off in La La Land, dreaming and all that. And then Daryl grabbed him by the hand and got up. And down on the ground was the necklace Rosita gave him. It's a sign. I don't know what it is, but it's a sign. So meanwhile, back in the house, Jesus says Gregory's in pain, but he's going to live. And so he tells the story about Negan, about how he has this group called the Saviors, and how the story about how he killed a young boy named Rory, who was only 16 years old, and beat him with a bat in front, killed him, beat him to death right in front of everyone. And then they all said, and Daryl said, we can help you. We can help you eliminate Negan and his men. He describes he has a group called the Saviors, and then Rick goes, how many? He goes, a lot, mostly 20. So if we take out Abraham, we save Craig. And would you hook us up? The boogeyman ain't done shit. What those pricks have been going on, talking about them being Saviors being pricks. The boogeyman ain't got no shit. And he said, if we take out the Saviors, would you hook us up? We want food, medicine, and one of them cows. And Jesus went, I'll talk to Gregory. So eventually they were all up in the balcony area waiting for answer to Gregory, and then Jesus got out and says Gregory's awake. Rick was going to go in to talk to him, but he said he wants to talk to Maggie. And so he says, she says, I got this. And then Jesus looked at him, I'm sorry, but Gregory can be such a prick. So eventually, Maggie finally got face to face with Jeffrey, who was lying in bed with his injury. And she said, they were trying to negotiate a deal. And he says, we can help eliminate Negan's men. You give us half. We want it. We give us half. You help us. We help you. And then Gregory went, done, deal. And he says, do you want anything else? And she goes, no, I want it. We want half of it now, and then half maybe in a couple of weeks or so. And then Gregor's just lying there clapping his hands, and they say, you made yourself a deal, honey. And then Maggie goes, and I also want one more thing. So eventually, they were all gathering supplies into the RV ready to go back to Alexandria, and Andy came along and Rick stopped him and said, we need your help. You need to tell us more about Negan and these Saviors. Yeah, we need to find out what they're up to. And he says, please, we need your help. And he agreed to go with them. And then Jesus says, if there's room for one more, I'm willing to go too. So eventually everyone was putting supplies in the RV. There were Glenn and Maggie with Harlan, and in the doctor's office, they see a sonogram of their baby for the first time. And then as soon as they all left the hilltop in the ending, Glenn and Maggie were handing the sonogram picture around to everyone to see. And that's the ending of it, when they drove off and left the hilltop and went back to Alexandria. I thought that episode was really well done. I love Jesus. I was fixated on him from the moment he stepped on in the episode The Next World. So eventually the episode was fine, and that's it to talk about the episode of Knots Untie. So next time when we meet, we're going to be talking about the next episode in Season 6, Episode 12, called Not Tomorrow Yet. So until next time, if you want to leave your comments, be free to do so. But remember, no bashing, no disrespect, no name calling, and warning, spoiler alert. So if you haven't seen this episode yet, do so before you watch me. Okay, so that'll be it for me. This is Jen signing off, and I will see you next time when we talk about the Season 6 Episode 12, Not Tomorrow Yet. Good night, all.